everyone. Welcome to the second episode of On Healing, Conversations about Wholeness. Today, I'm so excited to share that we have such an incredible guest today, Nakeia Homer, the author of this amazing book, Habits for Healing, which, as you can tell, I have made many bookmarks. I also have the book on audiobook, which I highly recommend because Nakeia is such an incredible narrator. It just feels healing just to listen to her words as well. So I highly recommend getting both of these. Today's conversation is going to be very exciting, and I'm very thrilled that all of you will have a chance to hear some of Nakeia's wisdom. It's going to be an insightful conversation, so we'll dig right in. I'm going to start with reading Nakeia's bio, which is incredible. Nakeia Homer is a well-being educator, author, and the founder of Heal and Grow Daily, a well-being community and private membership. Through programs, speaking, workshop facilitation, and corporate wellness consulting, Nakeia helps people sustain their well-being, operate in their brilliance, and show up in their lives and work as the best versions of themselves. Her books, I Hope This Helps, published in 2020, and All the Right Pieces, published in 2022, have been great resources for those seeking healing and growth worldwide. Her newest book, Habits for Healing, Reclaim Your Purpose, Peace, and Power, which was published in the fall of 2024, is already dubbed a roadmap to healing. Nakeia is a sought-after well-being expert and trauma-informed educator, facilitating powerful workshops and keynotes on the power of story, self-love, self-care, and purpose. Her Healing Inequality through Allyship course is at David Ekla's School of Business at the University of Utah. There's lots of ways to stay connected, and I'll add this in the notes for this podcast afterwards, but you can start by going to nakeiahomer.com, following her on social media at Nakeia Homer, and there's lots of other ways to stay connected, to hire her to speak at your event or join her community, all that you can find on her website. So let's dig right in. And before we start with what is going to be an incredible conversation, I would love to set an intention for our chat today, Nakeia, and maybe we can spend a few seconds just thinking about what our intention might be, and then you can go ahead and then I'll follow.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm extremely excited about our conversation. We've been able to talk briefly over the past few weeks, via email. And so seeing you, for those of you who don't know, we are looking at each other in addition to hearing each other, and then hearing your voice is amazing. I'm excited. I mean, so excited about the work that you are doing with On Healing, and excited that we are able to align. So how about that be an intention for us today? Alignment with our truest selves, alignment with our healing, our favorite versions of ourselves, and all of those good things. What about that?
Oh, I love that. I love that. So amazing. Okay, so my intention today is I am just eager to learn and to converse. I'm so honored to finally see you on screen and to meet you. And really for myself and all the listeners here to hear more about how to integrate some of these healing principles that you talk about in the book. I touch on some of these themes as well in my book, and really how to make these habits actionable, things that we can integrate, so that all listeners and viewers can really walk away from this conversation having a few key action steps and insights.
Love it.
So we'll dig right into our chat. So as I mentioned, I absolutely adore this book. You know, it's on my bedside table. It's definitely the kind of book where you can flip to really any page, and it's a perfect page, which will likely apply to whatever you're dealing with or healing from in that moment. So what inspired you to write this book? You've written other books before. What inspired you to really take on the topic of healing, and specifically to do so in the way that you did, which is a book that offers a lot of very practical, actionable insights?
Well, that's exactly why I wrote the book. My first two books are poetry and prose, maybe even a few essays. And so it's just short excerpts that you can read in the morning or in the evening, something to inspire your journal practice or something like that. And what I realized in writing those two books is that people wanted a little bit more. It's like now that I'm awakened to this idea of something like healing, which I identify as choices, daily practices, and habits, and even decisions that contribute to us being whole. What do I do with that? How do I do that based on my particular circumstance, where I am in my life? How do I do that after all that I've been through and all that I'm carrying? And so I wanted to create a resource that would allow people to think about their stories, the stories of their lives, their background, their history, and identify a way forward in a very practical, accessible way.
Amazing. It's incredible. And the response has been so amazing to watch too, as your wisdom is rippling out into the masses, and seeing people
Mhm.
really take healing into their own hands, which is incredible. Um, and in the book, you talk about healing not being a destination, but a practice. And it's something that I talk about in the book as well, in my book as well, around so much of the narrative and the discussion around healing can sometimes in society be focused on getting to a specific goal, right? I need to, do X, Y, and Z, and then I'll be changed, or then I'll be happy, or then. But can you speak more into this theme of it being a process, that it's not necessarily a destination, it's an ongoing practice. Sometimes we may regress, but it's incremental steps, and over time we'll see changes and hopefully feel more integrated and healed in our lives.
Yeah. So two things stand out when you bring that to the forefront. The first is often we can feel betrayed by the process or betrayed by our own journey, especially those of us who are journeying from a space of survival into a space of thriving or a life that better aligns with who we think that we are and who we know we are at our core. And so, something happens like a breakup. Let's talk about something, universal. No matter what your background, your history is, we've experienced some form of breakup, whether it's an interpersonal relationship with a beloved, a loved one, or breaking up from a job or breaking up from a friendship. And then we're like, now what? I don't have anyone. I'm lonely. This is the decision I made that I thought would be best for me. But what's next? Now I'm traumatized and I have trust issues. And so it was important for me to frame healing as a process that we may have to do over and over again, to frame healing as a series, like I just said, of decisions and choices that contribute to us being whole. And so it might be, what does healing look like? Or what does my journey look like now that I'm on the other side of the relationship? When you can identify that, that's healing. Right? That is a form of healing. You have options, you have choices, you have someplace else to go, in friendships and in love, theoretically. And so it was important for me to help those of us who really felt like we were being betrayed. I did the thing I needed to do, I made the choice, and now what? The other reason why it was important for me to share practices and habits is because, as a former counselor in corrections, one of the things I was charged with doing was creating programming that would prevent relapses or would prevent recidivism, which is someone going back into a lifestyle that created an environment that they would be arrested and go back to prison, right? Well, we can talk about our journeys in that way. There are patterns that we kind of break free from and grow out of. And then when life happens again, we might find ourselves in that same space, repeating those patterns, relapsing, in other words, if we don't have the proper practices in place. And so I just really wanted to reframe healing so that it was both accessible to empower us to contribute to our own healing, and to remind myself and everyone reading that we may have to heal again and again and again.
Oh, that's so true. It's a practice, isn't it? It's and I love that example of looking at something like recidivism and this idea of relapse. I'm reminded of there's this idea in sociology and behavior change called Prochaska's series of changes, where it's like,
Right.
you kind of go through the steps, but one of the steps is like there's like a spiral where you kind of relapse back, and it's like it's so powerful because that is the process, right? It is that it's not linear. To take 3 steps forward, we have to take a couple steps back. It's really
Right.
that incremental, shift over time with effort, with intention, with practice. And it kind of gets this idea of also like self compassion, having self compassion for that process. Um, you know, I love what you said about sort of the work that you were doing in corrections. Can you maybe expand a little bit on that and how that informed, your understanding of healing, but also, did it potentially give you new perspectives in terms of individuals that may find themselves in those situations and perhaps sort of the environmental factors that may have led them there?
hmm Sure, we could talk for hours on environmental impacts on our lives, things like poverty, things like addiction or dependency on, things to cope and survive. But more importantly, what was important for me to do, and I used to get chastised by a lot of my clients in prison because if you work in a prison system or for the justice system in any way, they call you a cop.
Oh,
And to them, cops are threatening. But I didn't present as a cop. And so they would say, Miss Homer, what are you doing here? What are you actually doing here? And one of the things that I was doing there was to offer a perspective that they didn't understand. Of course, I didn't self-disclose, but I came from a lot of the circumstances that they came from. I'm a Black girl who grew up in the United States in the projects. I had teenage parents. My dad was a drug addict. My uncle was a drug addict. And so often my home felt like a literal crack house. There were people, including those I just mentioned, that were in and out of prison. And I also knew that my father was a brilliant man. He was charismatic. He was a mentor in the environment, in our community, rather. And regardless of his personal struggles, everyone looked at him as he was, which was a mentor. He was a reverend, he was a minister. And this polarity and this ability to hold multiple things at once was necessary in order for me to make sense of my life. The same was true for my uncle, my neighbors, my mother, my grandmother, and then myself as I went through life making choices that weren't necessarily aligned with the best version of myself. I had to realize that two things can be true. You can create a life that's meaningful after circumstances like that if you choose to, or those circumstances can be so overwhelming that it's difficult for you to see the way out. And when those things are true in the lives of people, we can't discredit them or discount them or throw them away. There can be a form of rehabilitation. There can be a form of reprogramming that I think is necessary for them to go on and create a life. But I'm not far removed from some of the inmates I worked with, right? Again, I did things and made choices that were treasonous to my own self and my own body, that were criminal to my purpose and my calling. And if I was able to hold empathy for people outside of myself, see my father as more than just an addict, a teenage parent, etc. Then when those times happened in my own life where I made choices that I didn't love, I was able to apply that same compassion. In the book, I talk about self-forgiveness. I also talk about personal accountability because we can't go out here and commit crimes and think that we're not going to have to pay for them. We make choices that have consequences that we can also heal and rehabilitate from. And so, again, just being able to hold those two things, do work with people who, society has deemed as antisocial, but see them for who they were. It's difficult for me to not see that there is a person behind the behaviors, that there are people behind these choices, that I am human when I do things that I'm not necessarily proud of, or when I experience things in my body, like, years ago being diagnosed with kidney disease and then having to reconcile this life that I have to live while I heal that doesn't necessarily look like the one I wanted and still feel like I can show up for myself. So again, that was a mouthful, but I mean, I can go on and on about how my work has impacted my work in the field, I call it, has impacted my work that I do now.
I mean, I think that wasn't a mouthful to me. I mean, everything that you said is just, so much nuggets of wisdom, but so much stuck out. I think, the role of the environment, the
Mhm.
the ability to see with incredible empathy because you had lived experience, right?
Mhm.
And to the degree to which you had to sort of set a boundary, which we'll talk about boundaries in a moment, but um, with those that you were serving, that you couldn't necessarily disclose all of that. However, being able to see them with that lens of, hey, I see you, like I really
Mhm.
see you. It sounds like they sensed it, regardless of whether you were able to articulate it or not. And, I love what you also said about your father and, anyone that picks up Nakeia's book, which you all should. There's some really beautiful scenes in there where Nakeia talks about that relationship and the wedding day and really being able to show such profound acceptance. Um,
Mhm.
Not, pushing against reality, not attempting to change the other person or expect something different, but really just show incredible acceptance and compassion,
Mhm.
um, but through the lens of understanding self love, and of course boundaries and that sort of thing too. I mean,
Yeah.
that's incredibly powerful. I'm also reminded of that idea. I think it was Tupac Shakur around the rose that grew from concrete, right? Just all of the barriers that can exist, whether it's the social determinants of health, which you just spoke about, whether it's education, income, ethnicity,
Mhm.
geography. There's so many social determinants that we don't talk about in the wellness world as much, right? Like there's so much that impacts our well-being, our mortality, our morbidity, how long we live, you know, that is completely outside of our control and is completely linked to our social environments, our physical environments, how society sees us, the policies that serve or do not serve us.
Mhm.
Um, and I'd love to sort of get your take on, why is the wellness world not keen to necessarily talk about those issues? What are the barriers there? Something that I've definitely noticed as a physician and someone that trained in epidemiology, where I've had a very, sort of a front seat view into these concerns. But what I've noticed is often the conversation, whether it's around wellness, well-being, self-care,
Mhm.
um, focuses on things that are not accessible, that are for the 1%, that are juices,
Mhm.
potions, crystals. And there's a place for that, right? But why aren't we talking about some of these broader things? I'm curious to know your thoughts.
That's one of the reasons why I resonated with your work so much and why I appreciate the book that you're bringing into the world on healing, because you just spoke about it so eloquently, especially as a professional in your space, how all of these things are a part of our environment, but we don't actually see those things as part of our environment. In the wellness space, we talk about, our house, our physical homes. We talk about our bodies, of course, as a part of our environment. But like you said, there are social, economical, community, of course, mental, emotional. There are so many things that contribute to our environment. And we all know from education, like as far as literally the education system, teaching children from kindergarten on or preschool on, how important and impactful our environment is. And so, one of the reasons I think that we don't see that first is because we don't see ourselves as a collective. We experience the world through our personal based on where we've come from. And so it's difficult for us to relate to or be empathetic often with an experience we didn't live ourselves. And I think as a minority, both a woman and a Black woman, um, uh, grew up poor, it actually gave me layers that I'm able to build upon when it comes to creating my life personally and then working with others professionally that I think others don't get. And so I don't necessarily fault them, because they don't have that experience or that exposure. But I do think that we have a responsibility. Those who are clinicians, those who are physicians, those who are in the field working, and then in this entire wellness space to educate ourselves, right? You spoke about all of the things that can impact us. One of the earlier studies that are continue to be studied is adverse childhood experiences. And I share in my book that based on the assessment, I actually score a 10 out of 10. Every single adverse experience that they use to gauge whether a person will be healthy physically, healthy emotionally, and mentally, I was impacted negatively by. And then there are studies at all of the amazing universities about the impact of poverty on our decision making. But we have to think about poverty as a deficit. And there are deficits that aren't just specific to money or wealth. There are mental, emotional deficits. There are physical deficits. There are barriers, interpersonal barriers, ethnic barriers, historic barriers that also put us at a deficit that will impact our decision making as well. And so it's easy to say, drink a lot of water, move your body, make sure you get your monthly checkups when you are not at an emotional deficit, when you are not at a financial deficit, and you are in a space where you can make those choices. I talk about my grandmother who was in survival mode for as long as I can remember. Making good choices is relative because actually, and the studies show that they are actually making the best choice based on their circumstance. Of course, if we can change their circumstance, then we can change their options and we can change their choices. And so the holistic approach that you take in your work, I mean, I was so inspired by it. And I really commend you for having the conversation because I'm sure in your work and maybe with your colleagues, when you meet someone who may have something like I did, kidney disease, and then don't have the conversation about your history. We talk about what did your mom have? What did your father have? Fill out that form when you go to the doctor. But we have to go further. We have to talk about social impact as well, environmental impact as well.
No, absolutely. And, there's so much to unpack there. I think, you know, first of all, the adverse childhood experience survey. So it was Felidi and colleagues were kind of the first to do it. And it's in my book. It's in the notes section. Very powerful work that needs to be more actionable. And everyone needs to know about this as a factor behind, preventing the attainment of well-being. These are, real societal barriers, real circumstantial, environmental barriers to health and well-being. And when you think about, some of these factors, which of course, Nakeia, you faced in your own life from from a child, the impact that can do on, a child's self-esteem, a child's ability to self-actualize, the ability to even see themselves in people they admire, right? Whether it's a professor or a doctor or, whatever, being able to see that all of those things are impacted. So what ends up happening is there's this inequity that starts really early in life, arguably in the womb, right? So before birth. And then what ends up happening is there can be this expectation that the person, the child then catches up, and that is incredibly difficult. So it's about how do you start early, identifying these factors, but also, accepting that society has created these factors, right? Like it doesn't sort of come out of nowhere that Certainly, no one wakes up one day saying, I want this, I want to be incarcerated. It's like, how do
Right.
you look back at all the factors that led to that, which then makes you realize, has made me realize that actually this is the more statistically probable pathway to that initial path, right? So how do you move away from that into, you know, into a life path that the person feels like they're self-actualizing, that they're thriving. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, there's so much to unpack there, which kind of leads me, I think, to this next sort of idea of, in my book, I talk about some of our responses are actually rational. So some of our responses to environmental factors are rational. What I mean by that is that um, they are normal responses to abnormal situations. So what is an
Yes.
example of that? So if you imagine someone being in a war zone, if someone being in a war zone is in a high anxiety state, that is rational. Their nervous system is saying, this place is not safe. You need to run and find a safe place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is an extreme example, but there are many people that feel unsafe in their workplace, and it could be
Mm-hmm.
for a variety of reasons. It could be due to harassment and bullying, it could be due to prejudice, racism, it could be actual physical workplace environmental toxins. And so their nervous system, a normal nervous system, is one that would start to get activated, right? Um, so that is a normal response to an abnormal situation. That is very different from an abnormal response to a healthy situation. And oftentimes we confuse the two, right? We say, oh, that you shouldn't be anxious, you have nothing to be anxious about. Well, wait a second. Why don't we find out why this person's feeling this way? Why this person was triggered or activated? It's likely a rational response. So I'd love to hear more about, your approach to that. You talk about some ways to curb that in your book, but I would love to hear from you around, have you had a personal experience in that sort of situation where you were activated and really had to switch your environment, or put some of these tools into action, and what can viewers and listeners do using some of the tools in your book if they're faced with sort of that situation of being in a maladaptive situation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, again, something I could talk about for for hours and hours and hours about how our
This
bodies
is a
respond.
seven hour podcast, everybody.
Part one.
But part
Part
one
one.
of 12.
But yeah, we and there's and I love that it's being studied in the way that it is. And I wish I had known about these things early on. In my book, I talk about an encounter I had in my freshman year of college with my friend Eric. And out of all the stories in the book, aside from my grandmother and my father, I use his real name. I got his permission to use the story in his real name. And I was at war. Um, and it felt like I was at war. But I actually there was this internal war after surviving the hood, getting out, going to college, first generational college student. My dad and my mother both went to college, but neither graduated. Um, and got very far. And so I was doing something no one had done yet among us. And where I came from, you had to be on high alert, you had to be aggressive, you had to survive, you had to figure things out. And here I am amongst college students from all over the country, some from outside of the US. My friend Eric was from Wisconsin. He grew up in the suburbs. And so he's like, calm down. Everyone is not a threat, but I saw it as a threat. And that's what we do. Like you said, we don't know the difference between a perceived threat and a real threat. We don't know the difference between, well, I didn't know the difference between walking through my neighborhood, where there were, needles around and empty drug bags, gunshots, gang violence, all kinds of things like that. And being in school where, I'm trying to get a seat I wanted in class and someone's already sitting there, right? My body responded all the same way. And so one of the things that I teach in my work, and I actually started within the book, is self-care, because I wanted to change the conversation about self-care from spa days and, girls' night out or hunting or whatever it is you do to actual care for your existence. an actual regard for your well-being, an actual love for yourself, right? Your truest self, your highest self. When we talk about self-care from that perspective, I introduce something like selfish time. We're just spending time with yourself away from everyone else, time that you've prioritized, um, will put you in a position where you feel safer and calmer, and your baseline is now set more often than not. When we prioritize self-care, we're not at a heightened state on a regular basis because we have these daily practices like me, my drives home, right? That actually calms me. It soothes me when I am in a position or in an environment where I don't feel safe or I feel activated. I take a drive. I figure out reasons to go to Publix or Whole Foods or, to get to the car rider lane to pick up my son earlier so I could just sit there for 45 minutes sometimes before he even gets out of school so that I'm not constantly activated. And when you do come from an environment where you have to survive, you see everything as a fight, everything as a war, everything as a get me to where I need to be when I need to be there. And these small practices of asking yourself like questions, like I said, what do I need in this moment? When you feel triggered or activated, what do I need in this moment? What am I experiencing? I go through something I call the habit of investigation, where we're not taking what people say personally anymore because we are determining whether this is something I should internalize or leave with them, whether this actually applies to me, if this is a good source. So, really, every practice or habit in the book can help you when you are activated. But in increasing your ability, increasing these things or including these things, I should say, and then integrating these things into your life on a daily basis will help you to respond better more often.
Mhm.
So I hope I answered the
You
question.
definitely did. I mean, there's it's amazing. I mean, we're completely aligned. I love everything that you just shared, and really making these tools actionable, right?
We don't
And
always see it that way, though.
no, we don't.
We don't see our daily practices, our habits as a form of healthcare, as a form of mental health care
Mhm.
or emotional, spiritual health care. But I think, again, when you asked me in the beginning, why did I write this book? I wanted to one of the things that we feel, no matter where we are, let's say it's a medical diagnosis, like when I received one, and I talk about that moment in the book as well. It was about 20 years ago, I was diagnosed with kidney disease. And then again, while writing this book, had to see a physician for another diagnosis. It's like you're at war, right? Now I got to fight this disease or whatever. But again, if we see life as this experience we get, and how all of these things that happen are part of the lived experience and not necessarily there to end us, but to reveal who we are, right? To show us our strength, to empower us. What I was starting with is the fact that we often feel out of control when a doctor diagnoses us or when we're faced with some difficulty. These habits that we can actually affect every day gives us back our control.
No, I mean it's so true, and I think sort of to your point around, there's a couple things I wanted to kind of piggyback on. There was, um, the physical body does respond to trauma, right? The physical body, when we think about sort of this interaction between our minds, our environment, our emotions, and our physical body, and Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, is a great, starting point for people. But it's not just necessarily, back pain or muscle pain, which is a very common symptom, by the way, with chronic stress,
Right.
is to feel that muscular tension because, and it physiologically makes sense, right? If you're in fight or flight mode, if you're clenched, you are going to feel chronic muscle tension because you're activating those muscles so frequently. But there is also an impact, on that chronic stress and chronic response to trauma, chronic hypervigilance that
Mhm.
activates the HPA axis and the cortisol, right? And because you're
Mhm.
constantly kind of activating that, and the idea is called allostatic load. And what that does is it actually remodels the blood vessels in our body, right? So it leads over time. That remodeling leads to hypertension, contributes to heart disease, you know, all of that bad stuff, right? The cytokine
Mm.
response can impact inflammation, can put us at risk of autoimmune disease, that sort of thing. So the physical body responds in that way too,
Mhm.
which is why integrating, or finding ways to integrate the trauma and those difficult experiences so that we are healed has an impact not just on our well-being, mental health, emotional health, our interactions, our relationships, but as well as on our in our body, right? And there are moments when we do need to activate if we are running away from, a threat, a real threat, right?
Right.
But on average, it should be 1% of our week, to be quite
Wow.
honest. It should be a very small, part of our week. Some people are in this chronic stress, sort of sentiment all day. And sometimes, it keeps them up, it keeps them from sleeping
And for
um,
years,
for years, right? So there is a
which was
buildup.
me. That's
Right,
my story. Mhm.
right. Yeah. So it's like it's such a common thing. And I love that example of, seeing that your chair was taken in your classes
And I'm ready
because
to square
it's like,
off.
yeah, because it's like, it piggybacks really in an interesting way into sort of my next question, which I'm going to get to in a sec. But, this idea of this, when you're in that hypervigilant state, when you're in that threat state, because your entire being has remodeled to survive an environment that was not safe. So again,
Mhm.
rational, but now we've put the rose in, from the concrete to a healthy environment.
Mhm.
But the rose is still feeling like, okay, I've got to still push my way through. And it takes time to integrate, to make new decisions, to calm the nervous system. And in my book, I talk a little bit about internal family systems therapy, which I found very helpful, which is, for anyone that's sort of listening and watching, Nakeia knows this well, I know this well, but it really is, it's about honoring those different parts, right? So in the case of if you're in a situation where you see someone in your chair, right, that your protector may come out, someone that is ready to go in, confront the person, take what you feel is yours.
Right.
And then, the managers are, maybe might be more internal. They may feel that resentment or that anger, but really bury it inside, which of course is not great either, right? So most people kind of go in one way or the other. And part of healing is calibrating, knowing that sometimes we do need to exert ourselves, um, but often we don't. Often we can sort of sit with it, let the moment pass, evaluate if it is a real threat versus integrate. Um, what was really key for you, Nakeia, in terms of helping integrate some of those elements now that you obviously have not been in an environment like that for a while, but I'm sure every now and then it pops up.
Mhm.
What are some, like a couple of tools that you've used personally that have helped in that regard?
Yeah, so it took a while for me to understand the link between and the necessity to embrace integration. So, like you said, like say you go to, I remember my going to the doctor with my grandmother one day, and they did her. She's had chronic high blood pressure, diabetes, like everything. So when they took her blood pressure, it was like 155 over something, and I must have like lost the color in my face, and the nurse was like, "Oh no, that's good for her." And I thought to myself, like, what must your cells, everything in your body, your heart, what must it be doing to maintain 155 or to see 155 as normal all of these years? And taking the medication and you're just staying there, like, what is going on internally? And I realized that just years was being carved off of her life. And so many experiences were being carved off the quality of her life. And I realized that I needed to, you know, see the importance of all of these different things, not just the medicine and the doctor visits, and to see the impact of the stress of not being paid enough, being a single mom, living in a violent environment, and all of these things must have had on her body. And so at 10 years old, I actually made a decision. So I work backwards. And I believe that everything that I have is a divine gift from God. That's my personal experience. And so I set a goal at 10 years old to get out of the hood. And the only way I knew to get out of the hood was to get an education. Because my grandmother said, education, they can't take it from you. You get that, you're good. So I said, I'll get a good job that'll get me out of the hood. But I also didn't want to be the victim of domestic violence. And then I also didn't want to be a teenage parent. And so it was just all of these things that I saw, my immediate needs and my immediate desires, and how those things would have an impact on all of these different areas of my life. If I get an education, I get out of the hood, I'm not stressed out about money. So then that brings my blood pressure down a little, right? If I'm not in an environment where I'm in an abusive relationship, there it goes again. My stress is down. And it just keeps happening and happening until I don't have this life that I've created that contributes to my literal failure, physical, emotional, everything. And so that's the big picture. But then, as I continued this work on myself and continued this work in the world, what I realized is that deep breathing also brings down your blood pressure. And so I use the time that I sit in the car rider lane to pick my son up to pull out 59 breaths. That's an app that I love to help increase my heart rate variability, to improve that over time. And so then I'm going to the doctor, taking my blood pressure, and I don't need the medication if I'm using my breath work more often, or I'm able to balance things out if I have both in my life. So again, it's just about, for me, it has been about starting with what do I need?
Mhm.
How can I give myself what I need? What are practical, tangible, accessible ways that I can get what I need when I didn't have money, when I can't go see a therapist, when I don't have health insurance? What else can I do to really contribute to me being made whole? And so that was how things clicked when I'm in the seat in the classroom and I'm met with someone taking my seat and I feel like I want to fight. Okay, what do I need? Do I really need that in this moment? What is really going on? I talk about that in the book as well. Just asking yourself, what am I really feeling here? Where is this really coming from? When did I first feel this? When do I feel this the most? When is this a consistent thing in my life? Who is the source of this? And, just doing this deliberation that really just contributes to my well-being.
Mm.
So, breath work,
Yes.
journaling, regular doctor's visits. Even I'm not a clinician. I work in a spiritual and a well-being space where I tell people who come to me, have you seen your doctor to get your blood work done? What is your vitamin D and vitamin B levels like? What are your hormones doing? Go and see your doctor first. And then come back and let's have a conversation about why you might be moody or irritable or depressed.
Yeah, and it all goes together, right? It's all everything is a system that, one thing shifts, the other thing, vitamin D, if someone's low in vitamin D, they may not be getting it through the sun because they're stuck inside. Why are they stuck inside? Maybe because they're feeling down, right? But vitamin D is linked to mood. And by the way, my vitamin D, I surprisingly was very low, and people of color have a harder time converting the inactive form of vitamin D to the active form. And up until about 6 months ago, I always thought that if in the summertime I didn't need to take vitamin D supplements. I realize now that actually I do. And so if you haven't gotten your vitamin D checked, people, you should, it is worth checking. It is something that's pretty easy to supplement for and does have an
Mhm.
impact on many metabolic areas. I think what you said about your grandmother was really interesting too, because, and I wrote an article about this for, I think it was, I can't remember now, I think it was Nautilus magazine, and
Mhm.
Stat News did a follow-up investigation on this, but really looking at how, and this was something I had questioned in my medical school training. It's not in the book, um, but this idea of how, depending on someone's race, they may be offered a different form of treatment in the hospital. and
Yes.
specifically if someone is Black versus not Black. Um, and I dug into it in an article several months ago, and Stat News did an excellent investigation, I think a 6-part investigation into it. And the history is quite something. I mean, it goes back to the 1700s. And this idea that um, one's physiology or patient's physiology is different based on their race, which is completely crazy, right? It's not right. It's not correct. But what that has
Right.
done is that it has contributed to unequal treatment, inequitable treatment, a different blood pressure treatment, typically like a CCB, calcium channel blocker, for someone who's Black versus everybody else. And then over time, researchers realized, like, wait a second, the outcomes are actually not better; they're actually worse. And it all kind of started because of there was one study randomly that found that, that there was a statistical difference in someone's response. But it doesn't actually make a lot of sense today, and that is thankfully changing. But
Right.
that, on top of some of the societal factors that clearly your grandmother faced, right, caused her body to take on more of a burden. There were more credits over debits, so to speak, right? So of course she's giving, and her body, it's taking a toll on her body in a way that her blood pressure, her systolic blood pressure is 155, which is not normal,
Mm-mm.
and wreaks havoc all through one system. Changing tacks just a little bit now, and we sort of hinted at it slightly, but this idea of boundaries, and I love how you tie this in a couple of different chapters in your book. And in chapter 4 and chapter 5 together, I really resonated with you spoke about this idea of, some of your clients would come and talk to you about feeling a bit bitter in their life, that someone else was having something that they wanted.
Mm-mm.
And I saw the link between that sentiment and the sentiment that you talk about in chapter 5, which is about relationships and healing relationships around boundaries, and when do you sort of set a very strict boundary, which is cutting someone off, versus when you don't. And it's something that I talk a little bit about in the book. It's something that comes up time and time again. I am someone who I would say does have pretty strict boundaries with that stuff. I think, sort of to go back a little bit, is I'm the eldest of 5 kids, and I think maybe I had a bit of a scarcity mindset for a period of time over something really, really silly, which is a certain type of cereal that my mother would buy that was very, very delicious, very terrible for you, very sugar laden. And every Saturday morning, the 5 kids would compete, right? Because usually my brother would have 5 bowls of it and there'd be none left. So I remember that
Right.
very specifically as a scarcity kind of moment. But other than that, in general, when I see someone or meet someone who has an interesting experience, an interesting accomplishment, my tendency is actually to be inspired and to want to get to know them and to want to learn more and to have the
Mm-hmm.
conversations that we're having right now. But I've noticed that I often will intersect with people who have perhaps a core wound around that scarcity, where they're seeing something in me that is very triggering to them, and that is then projecting back at me. And then I feel like, oh goodness, I need to set a boundary because this is feeling really, really a lot. So I'd love to
Mm-hmm.
hear kind of your thoughts in terms of like that first bit around how do you talk to clients around releasing some of that bitterness or envy or jealousy, and maybe alchemizing it into something like inspiration, um,
Mm-hmm.
and then how that links to the boundary setting and how we can do that.
Yeah, really good question. I think your point about the cereal is probably one of the most practical examples of what scarcity actually looks like and how it starts. It may seem trivial, but that's a perfect example where it's like this thing that I love, this thing that I want, this thing that I desire, this thing that I feel aligns with me and my need and my want, all of the things. And then there not being enough of it because someone else has it, or there not being enough of it, or I may not be worthy of it. I may get there too late, so I'm too late to do whatever it is that I'm seeing other people do. And I think that uncovering the cause is great. and if you could do that through therapy where you're like, when I was 5, this happened, that happened. But if we just meet the moment or meet the thing, right where it is, and uncover the fact that you are seeing something and you are being activated, and activation isn't always a bad thing. Like, I remember when I first came online and they were like, you should put a trigger warning. And I'm like, everything I say is meant to trigger something. And trigger, we can get technical on it. There needs to be a thing that goes to another thing that goes to another thing that leads to all these different things. Or what is it triggering specifically? But if we just say to ourselves, why am I feeling away when I see that this other author has published their book? Or I'm a budding author and I want to put out my book. Dr. Amitha's putting out her book about healing, and I'm a physician and I have a whole take. And it's like, instead of us contributing to this work together, we get intimidated by it. And I think one of the things that I think most intimidates us or contributes to the intimidation is environment. Whenever I see someone feeling like they can't do something, I'm like, who told you? What about your life right now is showing you limits? What are you reading? What are you listening to? What are you watching? What about your last 5 text messages or group chats that is going on that is telling you that there's not enough? And it could be based on something that happened years ago or in your childhood. But if we meet the moment, how can we reprogram or reframe this misinformation, these lies, this narrative that's going on? And that's kind of how I address it. I remember when I first got online, I was being compared to all these other people. And I remember distinctly this one person saying, where have you been? It's like you're hidden. And I was like, I'm hidden. I'm invisible. No one sees. That was her projection.
Oh,
And I thought to myself, like, no, I just got an email from someone who said that my blog over here on my side of the internet was very helpful. I'm not hidden. So again, what are we taking in and what are we internalizing? I think that there is our work in the world. There is no one work that's to be done. There are no people, there are so many spaces. And I know in the medical field, they always say you'll never not have a job. Someone will always be sick or will always need healing, right? So there's space for us all. But I would say meet the moment. And then also, if you can go back and find the seed, the day, the space, the conversation, a bowl of cereal, that will be helpful as well.
no, I love that. And I use that example as like quite earnestly as really the last time that I think I ever experienced that, because I do see the world in an abundant way. In fact, I would say that because my interests and my background is so unusual, that if I
Mm,
find someone that even has some of the same things, I'm actually really excited because
me
it
too.
feels like I can build community and say, hey, like, let's talk about all this stuff that, have you faced this? Have you, like, what do you think about this? That's where I go, as opposed to, I had this sort of acquaintance that knew I was working on a book several months ago. And she said, wait, I'm working on a book. And I thought, that's okay. You can work
Yeah.
on your book. And I think it was
Right.
I think it was a novel too. It was like completely different, but there was something that was very triggered in her, I think. Um, and I'm constantly kind of interested in like, how do you alchemize that, especially, and maybe in the last like minute or two that we have, especially with women, and the next episode, I dive into this a bit more with someone who I talk about in my book. How do we build a community where women, and perhaps because of internalized misogyny, I think it
Mhm.
can be extremely difficult when we also think about the element of intersectionality, right? And this sort
Right.
of I don't know if you've read the book The Other Black Girl or if you've heard of that book, but it's a novel where it talks about this black woman that goes into this workspace and there's only one other young black woman, and it
It's
starts
a,
to,
it's a show now. It's a show like on Netflix or Hulu or somewhere.
yeah, and I've experienced similar things to that. And again, it's sort of this internalized, if it's misogyny, patriarchy, um,
Hmm.
scarcity, tokenism. um, Malcolm Gladwell, in his latest book, he talks about this idea of a third. I think the ratio is a third, that if an organization has 1/3 or 30% of that group, they tend to be successful. They tend to not compete. But if it's any less than that, it can be challenging. So I'd love sort of in the last minute or so, like, how do we build, especially among women,
Mhm.
that sense of abundance, that sense of let's truly support each other,
Yeah. And that's a good point. I wanted to say as well, when I was just, kind of talking about that, it is a very real thing. Like misogyny is a very real thing. Patriarchy is a very real thing. There is a literal glass ceiling. Um, there is, there are these times where there can only be one Black girl. There have been times, and when you've experienced that, again, we see that as a very real threat. And so it could have been that, your friend was told that, only she could be it or only her was going to be her. And here you are. And so you're like, what about me? So I think the way forward is to first start by acknowledging that it exists, that there are times where they don't make room for us and they don't open the door for us. And I think the way forward is to build our own buildings and to create our own space and make sure that we are formulating our own tables because we know it is a real thing to do what you're doing. You saw my book and saw what I was doing and said, "Hey, I got this coming up." And then I read your book and I was like, "Absolutely." And now we're creating this space and holding space for each other and to continue doing it, championing each other. I can't wait until your book comes out. And I can't wait to tell my membership about it because now we have a physician who actually sees us and who actually understands the importance of the work that we need to do outside of the examination room or outside of our yearly appointments. And you have the expertise and the willingness and the calling to actually do that and support us in that way. That's the way forward, acknowledging that it exists and then mobilizing and coming together so that we show people that there can be multiple brilliant women of color or women in general, or people from Canada, people from the US. I can invite you here and you can invite me there. And then they see the magic in it and then they'll want it more.
Oh, I love that. And what a perfect way to wrap up this episode. And I love sort of that sentiment of, if I could summarize it, you are enough. Every listener, every viewer, and everyone that's not listening and viewing, you are
Right?
enough. And there is enough. We live in an abundant world, right? It's your mindset. Work on healing yourself, work on integrating, work on returning to wholeness so that you can contribute to the wholeness of other people in our world.
Mhm.
So with that, thank you so much, Nakeia Homer. Her book is called Habits for Healing. You should also
Mhm.
get it on audiobook like me so that you can follow along and
Happy.
I love it. Yeah. It's perfect on your bedside table or coffee table or, maybe get a few copies for you and your friends. And thank you again for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I cannot wait to actually hold your book in my
Thank
hand,
you. Yes.
to tell
They're
everyone, oh,
friends.
look at that, they're
They're
friends.
friends. They've been hanging out.
Can't wait to tell everyone to go get it. I'm excited. I know that it's going to be a blessing, be an opening to people who feel like they are tied to old ways of being whole, old ways of healing, and one way of doing things. So thank you. Thank you for your work.
Of course. Thank you so much. And I will link to all the notes and all the different articles and Nakeia's community and website and everything in the section below. So stay tuned. Thanks so much, everybody, for listening. Take care.